Adam Eliyahu Berkowitz. Privileged today to have a guest I hope to learn a great deal from, Professor Rabbi Shaul Magid. He is the Distinguished Fellow in Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. If I went on to list all of his academic credentials, we'd be here all day. He's also served as the rabbi of the Fire Island Synagogue since 1997. He grew up as a non-observant Jew in New York, and at the age of 20, he started delving into his Jewish identity and Judaism. He became involved in the Haredi movement and studied modern Orthodoxy. He is an ordained Orthodox rabbi, and as well as being a professor of religious studies. I want to point out that I naturally, very naturally, in our last time we spoke, I kept referring to you as Rav. And I got a lot of flack for that from my Orthodox friends, even though it was accurate. You have smicha. And in addition, I'm clearly speaking to someone who I know that I'm speaking to someone who is steeped in Torah. So it came very naturally for me to do that.
Thank you. I mean, I can't say that I'm certainly not the only, but I'm a ordained Orthodox rabbi who's no longer an Orthodox Jew. So maybe that's part of what the
Well,
problem with the Rav.
I've
But you,
actually I've actually had this discussion with my rabbi, and you don't they don't repeal these titles.
no, they
Um,
don't. They don't. That's true.
Once a rabbi, always a rabbi. And the reason why I reached out to Professor Magid is he recently became wildly popular online. He was quoted by sources like the New Yorker, New York Times, Haaretz, the Forward. What's the Jacobin or Jacobin?
Jacobin, yeah,
Jacobin.
right.
Because of some ideas he was trying to get across. I have a feeling, I'm certainly not an academic or a scholar, but I got the feeling that a lot of people were misunderstanding you or trying to use you as a source for things you may not have entirely agreed with. So I'd really like to take this opportunity to hear from you directly from the source exactly what you were trying to get across. And you were being used to make political points, I believe, in some of those cases, whereas you weren't necessarily discussing religion. You were discussing Judaism and religious points.
Right.
I'm specifically referring to, I tried to understand an article you wrote in Religion Dispatches. And the article was titled Anti-Zionism equals Anti-Semitism isn't just wrong, it's the problem. And in that article, you were saying that you were trying to differentiate, if I'm not mistaken, between Zionism and Judaism. And you also came across with the idea that um, there is a form of Judaism that is viable in the exile.
Mm.
Am I presenting it correctly?
Sure, sure. So far, so good.
Really? Wow. Okay. I'm very proud of myself. You're not a black and white kind of guy. You're very nuanced. And it's not so anyone who disagrees with anything, I'd highly recommend you read through your Professor Magid's writing several times before you shout out that you disagree. And so I'd like to begin with something that you suggested in that article. Could you define for me what Zionism is?
Well, I get that's the big problem, I guess. I because
Exactly.
defining what Zionism is, first of all, um, you can't really define what anti-Zionism is unless you define what Zionism is. And of course, Zionism has many, many definitions, and anti-Zionism has an equal number of definitions. So, I mean, we have, in order to talk about it, we have to come to some kind of working definition, which is not obviously, complete, but at least it allows us to have a conversation. So, let's just say for the purposes of this conversation that Zionism is, from my perspective, and I think that people will, some of your listeners will disagree with the first assertion that I'm going to make, but nonetheless, that Zionism is a modern Jewish nationalist movement of self-determination. Um, it wasn't always about the establishment of a state. In fact, early on, it really wasn't about the establishment of a state. That was not really ultimate. That was really not really what was considered the ultimate goal, because it was not considered to be realistic. But it quickly became that over the course of a couple of decades. But it was about a kind of a Jewish national movement of self-determination, and, if you would like to use the term, liberation. Now, the relationship, it was largely a secular movement. There were
That's an
Jews.
interesting point, if I can interrupt you. The fact that Zionism was secular and now
Yes.
it's transforming into religious, and it's also it has a religious basis. I mean, there's the
Well,
whole
I would say it a little differently. So I think the way I understand it is that Zionism was a response to what became known in Europe as the Jewish question, which is the inability of the Jews to become integrated after the emancipation in the mid 19th century. The hope was, when Jews were going to become emancipated in Europe, they would be able to integrate and become full members of the societies in which they lived, and be able to continue to live their life in exile, because exile is a theological category, um, and without the fear of persecution, without all of the different kind of trappings of marginalization. And that turned out to be not the case for a variety of reasons. And here we can talk about anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is a term that only really is invented in the 1860s as a term. Um, and it really is also a way of responding to the integration and the kind of upward mobility of Jews after emancipation. So once Zionism does it, once Jews began to see, and these are Jews not in Eastern Europe, these are Jews in Central and Western Europe for the most part, once they begin to see that this emancipation promise is not being fulfilled, and you have the emergence of all these nationalist movements that are happening in Central and Western Europe, and some in Eastern Europe too. The Jews come up with an idea. And, Theodor Herzl, of course, is known as being the kind of, the godfather of Zionism, so to speak, but others as well, to say, well, maybe a Jewish national movement is the way to go. Maybe we can also become a nation in
I
the
hear
modern
that,
sense of the term.
but even the secular Zionism had a religious root. I mean, there was the whole question of whether or not to establish a Jewish state in Uganda. I wasn't exactly Uganda, but did it have to be specifically in the land of the covenant, the land of
Right.
Israel, the biblical homeland of the Jews? And even amongst the secular Zionists, there was a strong feeling that yes, it had to be here in Israel. So there was a religious element.
Well, I would say it's very interesting because, of course, Theodor Herzl was a person who entertained the Uganda plan, and there were other Zionists who entertained the plan of Argentina. There were all these different plans, right? And there was actually a whole movement that was in opposition to Zionism to some degree, called territorialism, which was basically, we have to be able to find a place for Jews to live as Jews, politically autonomous, wherever it is in the world, because Europe is falling apart and we have to save as many Jews as we can as quickly as we can. And the Zionist response was, no, it has to be in the land of Israel. That's the only way. It was a zero-sum game for them. And interestingly enough, one of the great Zionists of that period, Zev Jabotinsky, was actually quite sympathetic to the territorialist plan, because once we enter into the 1930s and stuff starts to become very dangerous, Jabotinsky too said, look, wherever we can find a place for Jews to be to save them from what's
Sure.
going on in Europe, that's what we have
And
to do.
in hindsight, we see that there was a big wisdom to that.
Yeah,
That
for sure. And Jabotinsky saw that even in the 20s. So I would say that the land of Israel was in many ways the obvious place for this Jewish state, because it's the Jewish homeland. But it wasn't that many Zionists didn't feel like that was the fait accompli. However, they knew that there was no way to get the Jewish masses of Eastern Europe on board with this project. Because remember, Zionism was not a popular idea in its early phases. In order to get Eastern European Jewry, which is where most of the Jews in Europe lived, in the Pale of Settlement, on board, it had to be the land of Israel because those Jews were much more traditionalist. So I think you're right in the sense that the land of Israel points to a particular kind of um, religious nature to the project, but it really wasn't a religious movement. And most religious Jews in Europe were against it for a variety of reasons and continued to be against it until the 1930s when Europe started to fall apart. And then it just became a kind of all out emergency situation of how do you get the Jews out of Europe as quickly as you can, with the Johnson-Reed Act in 1923 that the United States passed, which basically didn't close the gates to immigration, but it certainly limited them. And Jews didn't have really the opportunity to go to a lot of other places. So going to Palestine was sometimes the only option.
Now we're left with an interesting divergence, a fork in the road. On one hand, you have a non-religious Zionism, which includes, though is not exclusively, an attachment to the biblical homeland. And on the other side, we have another more secular aspect of Judaism, which says we don't need the Jewish homeland. We don't need the Bible land. You mentioned what was it, the Pittsburgh
Platform,
the
Pittsburgh
Pittsburgh
platform.
platform of the 1880s in America for the Reform movement. There were other things similar to it in the Enlightenment movement, where it was a distancing of themselves from Jewish nationalism.
Right. Look,
Um,
I think I would say it even stronger. I don't I think the origins of Zionism were not only a non-religious movement, I think they were anti-religious in many ways.
sure,
And
sure.
and Zionism was really constructed as a replacement for Judaism. And in the sense that this becomes what makes a Jew a Jew. And you find that in people like Berdichevsky and Brenner and and others. I mean, Aaron David Gordon was a little bit more complicated, but these were people who were really avid socialist secularists, and that these were the architects of this movement. Now, it's interestingly the religious Zionists before Kook, right? Once you have Rav Kook, things change. But the religious Zionists before Kook were not messianists for the most part. They were willing to buy into the Zionist project because it enabled them to live in Eretz Israel, which is where they wanted to live. But their relationship to Zionism as a movement was quite tenuous until much later. And you
It's
can see this in a variety of ways.
it's interesting when you said that. I really I have to take this in. Zionism was kind of like a replacement for Judaism. Am I
For some, it was considered to be that it was considered to be, yeah,
and
this
it was actually an anti-Torah movement, which it really was.
right.
You mentioned the religious Zionist movement, which has undergone serious challenges and dilemmas in recent times. It was closely allied with the secular Zionist movement, which
Mhm.
was anti-religious. And I had friends, I grew up in that movement as well, and it created internal conflicts that
Sure.
resulted in things like the expulsion of Jews from Gush Katif and a huge schism between religious Zionists and their home in the secular Zionist world.
Right. Right.
Um, yeah,
So, no, in a sense, Rev Kook is the kind of great revolutionary of religious Zionism because he was the first one who really made the claim that the secular Zionist movement, the transgressive, atheistic, secular Zionist movement, was really somehow a necessary part of this redemptive process which was unfolding.
right.
And so for Rev Kook, I think to really understand Rev Kook, you have to really believe, you have to really see that he thought things were going to change very quickly, that there was going to be a seismic shift, cosmic, theological, divine, prophetic, however you understand it. And that in some ironic way, um, it's the secularists who were willing to leave Europe and engage in this project of rebuilding the land of Israel. And ultimately, their secularism would be transformed once the Messianic era unfolded.
Right.
That was his optimism, right? And we
For
have to
the
realize he was optimistic because of Balfour. He was optimistic after World War One. He was optimistic with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. He of course dies in 1936, so we don't he doesn't see the real catastrophe of the Shoah. But for a lot of religious Jews, that was completely an absurd idea. That the secular, treif eating,
Sure.
Sabbath desecrating,
The kibbutznik on the tractor with the bare chest.
exactly. These are the people that are going to usher in the long-awaited Messianic era. I mean, he was really he was really not taken seriously by his religious community, um, except for very small number of people. Certainly during his lifetime.
For the listeners who aren't familiar, we're talking about Rav Avram Cohen Cook, who
Right.
was the Ashkenazi chief rabbi under the British Mandate before
Right.
the State of Israel.
Right.
And I actually learned in the yeshiva that was an offshoot of his yeshiva. It was called Machon Meir, if you
Yeah.
remember
Sure.
that.
Yeah. Sure.
And the way it was presented to me was that Rav Kook understood that the secular Zionists were Mashiach ben Yosef, the Messiah from the house of Joseph, who appeared as an Egyptian, who brought all these practical. He paved the way practically for the transcendent, mystical, miraculous Messiah from the house of David.
Right.
And interestingly enough, there's now an explanation that just as that the Mashiach ben Yosef corresponded to Shaul, the King Saul,
Yeah.
and therefore you see that King Saul and David were friends at first, and then Saul turned on David. So just as Saul turned on David, the secular Zionist movement turned on the religious Zionist movement, which
Mhm.
would usher in which will usher in the Messiah from the house of David.
Right. I mean,
That's how it was presented to me.
and there's a great example of that. So sometime in the 20s, I don't remember the exact year, Rev Kook took a trip around to these kibbutzim, to talk to these secular pioneers. And in a certain sense, to just to give them chizuk, to give them strength, but also to basically show that here's this, ultra Orthodox Jew and a kapata and a sparek or strimal, and he's going to he wants to affirm them. And from what we know, they kind of laughed at him. I mean, they really didn't take him seriously because their worldview was, we came to the land of Israel to build this place precisely to get away from you. That's
Right.
exactly that's exactly what they wanted to leave. And Rev Kook, he wasn't really that successful in his life to build those kinds of bridges, but certainly students afterward, after the establishment of the state, and then certainly after the 6 Day War, we can talk about his son and how that kind of catapulted the movement forward, created this model. I just want to say one other thing here, that one of the interesting differences between the secular Zionists and Kook is that Kook saw Zionism in a messianic register. He saw this as being the beginning of the unfolding of the long-awaited messianic era. And many of the secular Zionists basically abandoned the messianic idea. Like, no, we're not waiting for the Messiah to come. And we don't care about the Messiah. We're going to go and build a country, and we're going to be like everybody else. We want to be a normal nation, like every other nation. We want to have a language. We want to have a land. We want to have a country. And the messianic idea was something that many of them just left in Europe. So, in a certain sense, they were really talking at cross purposes. Cook was saying,
Mm.
yes, you think you're giving up the messianic idea, but you don't know that you're really a part of it, right? And the secular Zionists were saying, I don't know, whatever. Like we're engaged in a different kind of project. But interestingly, that secular Zionism of the kibbutzim, of the early kibbutzim, has kind of disappeared. And that's why religious Zionism has become so dominant.
Yeah, and that's actually come to a head now. The religious Zionists were. I had a friend who was grew up in the religious Zionists, and he became he went into Hesder. He served in the army, and he said, I'd rather sit down and have lunch with anti-religious seculars than with Haredim. He was that, and he didn't. And when Gush Katif came along and the seculars pretty much stabbed the religious in the back, um, it was like they had nowhere to go. Their best friend had just stabbed them in the back.
Right.
And there was that problem. What I'm finding now, by the way, okay. What I'd be interested to hear from you is two things. So what I'd like to know now is you expressed that there could be an exile Judaism separate from the concept of the land of Judaism. I always understood that the land of Israel was essential to the covenant, which was our bond with the God of Israel. And that if you take away the land of Israel, there is no bond, there is no covenant. But I seem to understand from your writing that it's not exactly the way you see it.
No, I don't see it for the following reason. I mean, I fully kind of agree with you. I mean, it's kind of an obvious point that the land of Israel is the homeland of the Jews, and it's certainly the Jews have a very deep historical connection to the land. They have a deep theological connection to the land, but there is a vast difference between the homeland of the Jews and the nation state of Israel. It happens to be that the nation state Israel is in the homeland of the Jews, but the holiness of the land, the homelandness of the land, exists in the same way with or without a state. The state is a modern layering on top of something that's ancient. So you could say that there is some sanctity to the state, and that's what Tzvi Yehuda Kook says, and that's basically one of his major moves, is from the holiness of the land to the holiness of the state. Of course, his father, Abraham Kook, never talked about the holiness of the state because there was no state. But certainly with Tzvi Yehuda Kook, there is a sense where there is a transference of the kedusha, of the holiness, of the sanctity of the land of Israel to the sanctity of the state of Israel.
This,
I
this
find that to be an extremely dangerous move, and
I do too. And
I think
also
that,
I
yeah,
don't feel the same way about the state as I do about. I see the land as a manifestation, a physical manifestation of the connection between God and Israel.
yeah. But that again, that exists whether there's a state. It existed long before there was a state, and it'll exist if the state somehow in the future ceases to exist. I mean, one of the things I do want to say, which people have been talking about recently, is that there is, and this goes to the question of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and Zionism in general. Somehow, and I think October 7th um, in some way contributed to raising this. The idea was that you create a state, a Jewish state, a nation state, and that state has some kind of permanence that the existence of the Jews before the nation state didn't have. But I think it's really the opposite. States, forgetting about Israel. States in general are not permanent entities. They come and go. Empires come and go. States come and go. I mean, arguably, Isaac Bashevis Singer, in a really interesting article on Yiddish called Yiddish, the Language of Exile, says that, if the Jews had not been exiled from the land, if they had stayed in the land, they probably would have disappeared a long time ago. And
Like the Romans and the Greeks and all the
like
other guys
everybody.
from that time.
So when we talk about the fact that the Jews had survived for 2,000 years, and we look at that as being some kind of a distinctive phenomenon among peoples, part of it maybe is that we never had a state. So that it's the dispersion that enables the survival. So, in a certain sense, there was something that was very powerful that I heard in an interview with a woman after October 7th, who was around, in the Gaza envelope. She was, a survivor in one of those kibbutzim. And she said, what October 7th taught me was that we thought we were Israelis, but we're really Jews. And what she was saying was, by saying we thought we were Israelis, we thought we were protected from something like this because we had a state. And we realized that we're not protected. The way Jews haven't been protected for millennia, we're not protected now either. And I think it was a very kind of flippant but also profound comment that I think that she came to realize, to say, no, the states don't necessarily save their citizens. Sometimes states actually endanger their citizens. That's the way states are. And, the army is in charge of saving the citizens of a state. And if the army doesn't show up, citizens die. And in a certain,
sure.
Right. And in a certain, like in any country, like in any place.
Right.
So in a certain sense, so much of Zionism, which was a response to the being tired and weary of living an exilic, disempowered existence, brought about this false sense of security that if we had a state, we would be safe. And I think that was a deep misunderstanding of what states do and what states are. I mean, yes, you can be safe in some contexts and you can be unsafe in other contexts. And I think that, October 7th, in a certain way, in all of its horror and all of its tragedy, and, stepping outside of the politics of it, basically for a lot of Israelis, oh, so the state's not going to necessarily save us. That's just not what happens.
I'm hoping I understand you correctly, which is, it's not easy, because we're definitely coming from very different approaches. Right. Did I understand you that you said, for example, like the Kedusha, the sanctity that I assign to the land of Israel, the land being a manifestation of the connection with God, you seem to be assigning that sanctity to the inherent connection between the nation of Israel and the God of Israel.
I wouldn't call it, I would call it the people of Israel rather than
people
the
of
nation.
Israel. Okay.
Right, yeah, the people of Israel. Yeah, I mean, there is a deep connection from somebody who lives inside of the covenantal paradigm of the Hebrew Bible and its interpreters, the tradition, that there is a deep inherent connection between the land of Israel and the people of Israel. I don't know if I would make it mystical or not, or cosmic, but it's certainly a deeply embedded part of collective Jewish memory. And that has nothing to do with the state. That's a phenomenon that is theological, it's belief-based, it's metaphysical, it's not the practicalities of...
Does it have a national element?
Well, the word nation is a strange term because, when does the concept of a nation begin? When does nationalism begin? So, scholars of nationalism talk about, is nationalism an invention of a kind of a post-empire era of Europe, where you have the kind of emergence of these notions of nations or nationalities. You can argue a lot of different kind of ways. Are nations imagined communities like Benedict Anderson or like someone like Anthony Smith who would say no, the concept of nation goes much further back. I don't, I'm not averse to using the term nation, but certainly the nationalism that is the present state of the state of Israel, Jewish nationalism, is, in my mind, a product of modernity, which I don't necessarily is a bad thing. But I don't think that the notion of, which is why in Hebrew they had to create a new term, because there really isn't a term for nation. There's a term for people. But the
Ah,
term
I
for
get it.
nation of calling it leum or something like that, I mean, they had to invent a new term because it didn't really have an antecedent in traditional Hebrew language. So again, I know that in the kind of religious Zionist worldview, um, Zionism is ancient. The nation of Israel is ancient. All of those things, they all go back to the Bible. I heard, for example, yesterday, which I thought was kind of a little bit silly, but I'll say it anyway. Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League said Moses was the first Zionist and Paro was the first anti-Zionist. I mean, you can kind of, you can play with that language. I don't think it's really very useful, and I don't think for somebody who has spent the last 40 years of my life, studying Judaism and the Jewish tradition, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
I had an interesting experience that I'd like to share with you.
Sure.
Recently, there was a new embassy, and you can question whether it's actually an embassy, though the people who started it really do think it's an embassy of the indigenous people. And it was the Maoris from New Zealand, I think, were the forerunners. There were a few Native American Indians, friends of mine who were involved in this. And indigenous, they look to Israel and the Jewish return to Israel as a beacon of hope for the indigenous movement, for the indigenous peoples of the world.
Right.
And implicit in that is the concept of homeland, which for me, as a Jew, homeland takes on as I said before, the manifestation of the covenant. It's there's a holiness there, which you don't seem to share that
Oh,
idea.
I think there's a holiness there. I know that the language of indigeneity has now been taken up by Zionists and quite new, and it's quite new actually. I mean, the indigenous argument was really the classical Palestinian argument that we've been living here for
Yes, it
hundreds of
was.
right.
Yeah.
We've been living here for hundreds of years. We're kind of indigenous, we're the indigenous people, and you're coming and you're colonizing, right? That was the whole language that the Jews were the colonizers and the Palestinians were indigenous. And now basically, interestingly, in some national religious circles, the argument is being flipped as saying, no, we're actually the indigenous people and we're decolonizing the land that you colonized in the Islamic conquests in the 7th century. So it's very kind of interesting, the play of that language. Now, the truth is that indigeneity is a very, very complicated term. There's an entire subfield in academia of indigenous studies. What does indigeneity mean? How do you constitute an indigenous people? Right? If a people leaves a land for 2,000 years and comes back, can they claim that indigeneity when other people had been living there during that time? I mean, it's a complicated story, and you can see it in all different kinds of ways. But what's interesting about the fact that some of the national religious people are flipping that argument is in some way they actually see that it's a pretty compelling argument, that claim of indigeneity. Now,
For
again,
the Jews. Yeah.
I think there's a difference between a Jewish homeland that is based on theological principles and historical memory, and the claim of indigeneity. I'm not to say that I'm not making a claim either way that Jews are not indigenous to the land of Israel or are indigenous to the land of Israel. I'm just saying that the claim of historical memory for me a more powerful and more compelling argument than getting into competing indigeneities, because that's ultimately what he's saying. So basically, it's interesting. It's interesting, for example, that the Zionism or the Zionists are saying, well, we're not colonialists. Forgetting about settler colonialism, that's a whole different story. We're not colonialists, and yet the people that live in the West Bank are called settlers, right? And in fact, if we want to go back to the Bible, Abraham was not indigenous to the land of Israel. Abraham was indigenous to Ur of Kasdim, right? He was a conqueror and considered to be a sojourner, a ger, in the land of Israel. So the relationship between the land of Israel and the Israelites, or the progeny of Abraham, it becomes a morashat, becomes a divine inheritance. It's not an indigenous claim. It's very hard to make the indigenous claim from the book of Genesis, or even from the book of Exodus, or even from the book of Joshua. I mean, they go from the outside, they come in and they said, God gave us this land and we're going to basically, go to war against the indigenous people.
Yeah.
So
we're required to wipe them out.
Exactly.
Okay. It's you really made me given me so much to think about. I'm sure I'll be walking around next week going, I should have said.
That's right. That's right.
I have a question. You, at one point in your life, came to Israel. You lived in Israel for how long?
About 10 years.
10 years is not a quick visit.
Right.
When you were here, what was your perception of, why did you stay here? Why did you come? What was your perception of Israel?
My coming to Israel was really, as I say in my book, actually, I don't think I really heard the word Zionism until I was a junior in high school or a senior. Like, it wasn't a term that was really had any meaning to me whatsoever. I came to Israel, on, for lack of a better term, a kind of, countercultural spiritual quest. I mean, I was about tshuva, and I fell in love with the land. And to some degree, I fell in love with the country, but I certainly fell in love with the land. And my being there was, I talk about this in the chapter. I have this chapter in my new book called my tragic love affair with Israel, where I talk about my life in the Haredi world, in Geula and Zichron Moshe and Me'ez Sharim, and then breaking out of that by being introduced to the writings of Rav Kook, and then becoming totally kind of infatuated with what was then the early iterations of the settler movement. And we looked into moving onto different kinds of settlements, and I saw the difference between the Haredim and the settlers, as the Haredim were living to preserve the past, and the settlers were living to create the future. Right?
Yeah,
so
that's exactly it. That was my perception as well. I'm like, their idea of the perfect Judaism was their great grandfather, and my idea of the perfect Judaism was the land.
Right. So I felt I felt very caught up in that. I became disillusioned because I did realize, look, I was coming from America, coming from a liberal, progressive, upbringing, that I came to recognize that as beautiful and as future oriented and as optimistic as the settler movement was, and many of the people that I met in that world, in many settlements that I visited, they didn't see these other people walking around who, were just Palestinians. They were not part of the future. They were not part of the plan. They existed almost like flora and fauna, like they were there as like background to this new project. And there wasn't, when I was there, it wasn't that there was a lot of hatred toward them. It was just disinterest. It's just like these people are just not, they're part of the past and not part of the future. And I started to recognize, wait, there's a whole, especially when I was in the army, and I was like, walking through Shrem and walking through these places which I had never been to before. There's like a whole world there. There's a whole society. There's generations. There's family lineages. Like you
And they are
can't just
connected to the land. They
yeah,
do.
and deeply connected to the land. And to just say, it was just kind of erasure, a gentle erasure. It became more and more angry as time went on. After the Second Intifada, it
Yeah,
changed completely, right?
yeah.
But I realized that you can't build a future by erasing the people who are living there. You just can't. I mean, you can, and the truth is, Israel is on some level, but I don't think it's really something that I felt I could be a part of.
I hear that. I hear
Yeah.
that. I wish we could come up with a different term other than settler, which in its essence is not a pejorative. It's not a negative term.
Sure.
You've come to settle the land. It has a very positive connotation, but
Right.
it's taken on it's funny that in Hebrew they call the settlers mitnachalim,
Yeah.
which literally means the ones who come to inherit. They come to
Yes.
take, but it actually, in modern Israel slang, it means like butting in, grabbing something that isn't yours.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
really unfortunate.
Yeah.
It's really
Yeah.
unfortunate.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so do you come back to Israel sometimes?
I do. I mean, I usually come back about once a year for a variety of reasons, academic conferences and things. I was supposed to be there in June, and I had to cancel because I had my son had a medical issue that he had to deal with. But
Mm.
yeah,
Oh, come on.
I'll
You
come
you
back.
you love the land. You can admit it. You love the place.
Oh, I would never deny that. I mean, I love the land. I think that I love the place. I love the land. I love many people that live there. I feel um, it's that's why for me it's painful.
Mm,
It's painful. It's painful
I hear
because
that.
um, I'm, witnessing something that we're all witnessing the same thing, but we all have different interpretations of it. I'm witnessing something that um, I think is increasingly becoming tragic, and it's not, in a certain sense, part of it is really not Israel's not to blame at all. I think, part of it, what a lot of people don't spend enough time talking about, which I've written about a little bit, is that, where did that really humanistic left wing kibbutz Zionism go?
Right.
And it was swallowed up by globalization and capitalism to some extent.
It was absolutely, it's funny, those very same people or their spiritual and physical descendants who were the kibbutzniks on the tractor, bare-chested, jumping from the tractor into the tank. Their descendants are high-tech, very much capitalistic, overly capitalistic. I remember Tel Aviv used to be a lovely town where you could see, young couples with a baby carriage next to artists, next to, the budding tycoons. And now it's just so overpriced. All you see are the uber wealthy. I think Tel Aviv has one of the highest per capita number of millionaires, or it's just
Right.
it's and the real estate is, and it's changed the nature of Zionism with what used to be secular Zionism just doesn't exist anymore. It's become
Right.
something else entirely.
Yeah, I had a teacher at the university who was really maybe one of my most influential um, teachers, named Eliezer Schweid, who passed away some years ago, really a few years ago. And at the end of his life, he wrote a series of books on on how globalization is destroying Zionism.
Whoa.
And I wrote an essay for a Festschrift in his honor, and it was basically an analysis of his idea of globalization, and it was really basically saying that Startup Nation is, very often Startup Nation is viewed as a kind of, a certain kind of in the exemplar of Israel's success, becoming a first world
Yeah, it's the
nation.
banner. It's we
Yeah,
love the
but
wave.
Startup Nation has a very, very dark side, and that is basically it's about globalization. And a lot of those people, they live in Krush Mayahu, they have an apartment in Palo Alto, they have a house in Paris and in London. In other words, they're international people. They're not really so much a part of the Zionist project anymore. And I think that a lot of the vacuum that was created through the collapse of that really progressive humanistic left-wing Zionism is a kind of chauvinistic religious Zionism that's just filled that space, even
Wow.
among the people who are not dati necessarily. It's filled that space, and that's what the country is right now.
Wow.
It's settled into being a culture of domination. And one could argue from the Zionist side, well, this is just necessary. We don't have any other choice. Um, Maybe now that's true. I don't think that was
And
true
also
25.
a form of social Darwinism. We're the high-tech nation, so we deserve to take over.
Right. Yeah. It was prosperity gospel. Yeah.
Yeah.
I, I think
It's Jewish style. Yeah.
a Jewish style prosperity gospel. Yeah. I really, and that's why for me, I feel very much pained by it. And I'm sure that there are plenty of people who are, to the right of me that will say, okay, good. So go leave and go do something else. And let us drive, let us take the steering wheel. And I think that's kind of what's happening is that, and the protest movement was an interesting moment of a wake up to say there is some other form of Zionism that exists, and it's beginning to kind of exercise its muscles.
A social Zionism.
On the judicial reforms, right? On autocracy, but the protest movements, and I was certainly supportive of them. That was not a left wing movement. That was a centrist movement. That was not about the occupation. That was about the kind of the demise of the power of Jewish democracy for Jews, for the most part. So, I feel very much a part of the place. I feel very much a part of the project, but I feel there's less and less of a place for me there.
Mm. I hope you're wrong. I really
Well,
do.
no, look, I mean,
I'd like to see you hear more. I think.
look, yeah, look, something. There are people like me. I'll be honest with you, Eliyahu. People like me. Every time we go to the passport control, we're worried that we're going to be flagged.
Oh gosh, I hope not.
I mean, I know people. I know friends of mine who have been, but I'm just
Really?
saying. Yeah, that's kind of I know two or three friends of mine who have been flagged. Now, maybe I'm not important enough to be flagged, but I'm just saying that's how we feel. We feel like, in a certain sense, the state has really rejected us.
Mm.
Or maybe we rejected them, or maybe it was a mutual consensual divorce. I have no idea, but I feel that's kind of the way I feel, and even living in America, because we didn't talk about America, which is a very different context and very different things are going
Sure.
on. Um, there's a strong movement to marginalize people like me from the conversation, because the conversation can never really be about questioning Zionism.
Well, my perception of traditional Judaism is question everything. The whole concept of chokhmah, of wisdom, is koach ma, the strength of the question.
Right.
And in order to be a heretic, you have to be really, really smart and well versed in the Bible. And it's not just anyway, I could sit here and talk with you for more than just one day. Every time I speak with you, I learn an awful lot.
Thank
And
you. I
as I
appreciate
said, even if I don't agree,
Yeah.
um, I respect you more and more every time we speak.
One of the points that I did want to make, which is really the crux of the book, is
Okay. Of
to
your new
really
book.
to think about this new book called The Necessity of Exile, is to think about distinguishing between Zionism and the state of Israel, and to say that Zionism brought the state of Israel into existence. There's no doubt about that. The state of Israel would not have come into existence without Zionism, and probably not without secular Zionism. But it's worth considering whether Zionism has done its work, and we have to think of another way of constructing a life of coexistence with Jews and non-Jews in that state and in that
Yeah, and
place.
there is a growing schism between Israel and the exiled Jews, the Jews who are not in Israel. And very few people feel comfortable with that. We're a nation, we're Jews, we've always been together, and we'd like to stay together.
Yeah,
That's
I mean, I think that one of the problems, one of the fundamental problems that we were talking about in the beginning, and how do you define um, Zionism? And one of the things that I found very generative for me is something that a Zionist historian named Chaim Gans wrote in one of his books, that what he called proprietary Zionism, that most Zionism is founded on the assumption that the land of Israel belongs to the Jews. However you understand it belongs to the Jews, whether God gave it to them or whatever, they conquered it, that the land of Israel belongs to the Jews, and we'll decide what to do with it, and we'll decide if we're going to give it to another people, and we'll decide on what conditions and what criteria we give it to another people, but generally it's our land. Like the you probably remember from growing up the opening song to the movie Exodus, sung by Pat Boone, if you can remember, right? Right. This land is mine. God gave this land to me. That's the opening line of the song of Exodus, right? That in a certain sense educated generations of Jews in the diaspora, right? This land is mine, God gave this land to me. It's very romantic, and there's a big vista of the Judean desert. But I think that's a problem. I don't see how we can really continue to construct a society where close to 1/4, and even maybe more than that, of people are not Jews. How do I think that we have to give up this notion that all of it belongs to us, and then we'll give it to whoever we want, given the conditions that we want. So it's, in the same way you could say, Ahmed Tibi can get up and say, okay, I'm an Israeli Palestinian or Israeli Arab, however they want to identify. How am I? This is a good question, right? How am I, an Israeli Arab? How am I, who is a citizen of the state of Israel with a passport? How do I stand up and sing the national anthem? The
about
national anthem, he said, the national anthem doesn't only exclude me, the national anthem erases me. Like what if the national anthem of America was just about white Christians? So I mean, we have to think about these things. I understand that the Hatikva could be the Zionist national anthem, but maybe the national anthem of the state of Israel has to be something a little more inclusive.
understood. Okay.
So those are the kinds of things that kind of interest me. I'm not a political scientist. I don't deal with policy issues, but there's fundamental ways of like who doesn't feel moved by singing Hatikva? But what is Ahmed Tibi? How is he supposed to sing the national anthem of the country that he's a citizen of?
Not just Ahmad Tibi, anyone who was not in exile for 2,000 years and has the tikva, who has the hope for 2,000
Exactly,
years to return to their land.
exactly.
Especially even more so people who are descendants of people who have lived here for several hundred years.
Right, exactly.
I hear
Exactly.
that. I hear that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Magid. I'm going to put the link to his book in the video at the description of the video. I'd like to urge anyone who disagrees or feels strongly about this, I highly recommend you sit on that, think about it, read what Professor Magid has to say. I think you're misunderstood. I'm an ardent Zionist, and I did not feel that I entirely disagreed with you. I
More.
did not feel that I disagreed with you in the most part. You were saying things that were incredibly valid and should be thought about.
That, you know, for people that are interested, there's a podcast called The Dig, which is through Jacobin Magazine. And I did a 4 hour podcast,
Wow.
2 2 hour episodes on the history of Zionism and anti Zionism, which, um, if people are interested in listening to,
Yeah, and
welcome.
these are hugely important. These are issues that are leading to conflict in Israel. Um, you know,
Sure.
so
Yeah.
it's definitely necessary to think about it and to work it through. Thank you so much, Professor Magid. I hope to see you in Israel. I hope to have a cup of
Yeah.
coffee with you on my front porch, or my back porch, rather.
That'd be
Um,
great.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much. You all be blessed. Don't go away, Professor Magid. And if you liked what you heard, please hit that like button, subscribe. This is a new channel, and we're going to be trying to give you thought-provoking and compelling content about Israel, about this modern manifestation of prophecy that is taking on political proportions, and right now is at the focus of world thought right now. So, thanks very much to y'all. Be blessed.